Brothers, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar hosted by 1848 Properties Incorporated, titled 21st Century Approach to House Corporation Operations. This was a popular session from the 170th Ekklesia Housing Conference, which 1848 Properties wanted to make available to all House Corporation members. With us this evening are several members of the 1848 Properties Board of Directors. I will introduce them in just one moment. But before we do, brothers, I want to just run you through some logistics for tonight's webinar. You are all muted on tonight's webinar to help us keep the sanity on this end and cut the background noise. So please be aware, if you do have questions, we welcome them. You will need to use some of the features of GoToWebinar to ask those questions. If you're on a laptop or tablet or PC, you should see a questions box where you can type those questions in and we will receive those here. If you're on a mobile phone, look for a small question mark icon towards the upper part of your screen. Brothers, you can certainly ask questions at any time, but just know that we will wait until the end of the webinar to answer most, if not all of those. And we will do our best to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can, but if we run out of time, please forgive us, brothers. So brothers, without further ado, and to get us started this evening, I would like to introduce Steve Bacher, Denver, class of 1983, president of 1848 Properties, Inc., who's going to be rolling us through our material tonight. Steve?
Thank you. Appreciate it, Rob. Good evening, brothers. We're very excited to be able to present this session to you tonight. As Rob mentioned, this was one of the most popular sessions at the Housing Conference at the Ekklesia this summer, and we believe that this is a great information session for you and a great opportunity for us to share what so many brothers enjoyed at the Ekklesia this summer with you. We're excited that over 50 brothers chose to sign up for the webinar, and we see that you're located all around the country, so that's very exciting. Before I get into the presentation itself, let me introduce the rest of the board to you. On the phone right now with us is Pete Walsh from Wittenberg 74. He's the treasurer of 1874 Properties, or 1848 Properties, and Josh Hawley, also a member of the Archon Board from Tennessee 97, is on with us. We hope to have Jim Lee joining us in a few minutes. For most of you, my guess is you've not been exposed directly with 1848 Properties. We've had members of our board at the past Academy and Ekklesia, but we know that a lot of the House Corporation members haven't gotten to meet us face to face. So I thought a good starting point for this session would be just to take a second to explain what 1848 Properties' mission and vision is. 1848 Properties, Inc. was created by the Archons last fall, and really there was a main purpose, and that was to be the voice for housing and housing-related issues within Phi Gamma Delta. I don't need to tell any of you that the fraternity has been busy with a lot of fronts, with recruitment, with risk management, with leadership, and housing hasn't been one of the areas that's been a strong priority in terms of communication and resources. But the fraternity recognized that was something that needed to be enhanced, and so that was one of the guiding reasons that 1848 Properties was created. In addition to our role as being the standard bearer for housing within the fraternity, we also have a responsibility to be a fiduciary for housing-related assets that have been turned over to the fraternity. Our bylaws call when a chapter closes and a house is liquidated for those assets to be turned back to the fraternity and be held in trust for that chapter. And the because of some legal issues and some cases that have happened in with other Greek organizations, the decision was made to create a separate legal entity to hold those assets so that in case of a lawsuit, many of you know the fraternity is self-insured, that the housing-related assets would be separate from the fraternity's assets. And so within those kinds of constructs, 1848 was created, and really the piece that I want to share and highlight is the vision statement that you see on this screen. Really our goal, our challenge and goal is to challenge our membership to maintain the highest standards of safety and excellence within housing. And really that's the spirit in which we want to do this seminar with you today, entitled The 21st Century Approach to House Corporation Operations. And so let's jump into that content. The first question we want to ask is, are we excellent right now? And the answer to that is every house corporation is different, just like all our chapters are different. They're all operating at different levels of sophistication. There are different energy levels within the various house corporation boards. And what we know is that you want support and assistance to accomplish your goals. And we know that to be consistent with our 21st century strategy, that we need to be really spurring ourselves to move forward consistently to be successful in this housing endeavor. Running a house corporation is getting more complicated than ever. We've got legal issues like we've never seen before. We've got changing expectations of the students going to college in terms of what they expect in their housing facilities. We've got aging facilities, structural lifespan limits. We've got increased competition on our campuses. Many universities around the country are upping their game and spending millions of dollars upgrading their dormitories into quads, into single bedroom with bath type of accommodations. And other fraternities are also spending money improving their facilities. We've got other complications, including less tolerance from the universities themselves. We're seeing, in some instances, almost a hostile environment towards the Greeks, and in others, one where they're just ready to pounce at the most minor type of infraction. We're seeing complications and involvement from government entities, and we're seeing that in Pennsylvania. And many of you know what the legislature has been doing there. And then we've got another set of complications, which is we're going to be seeing fluctuations in college enrollment over the next 10 years. And so we're going to have a changing base of students coming through the college system. So one of the things that we need to do as a house corporation board is ask ourselves some questions. And by the way, throughout this presentation, a couple of times through this presentation, you're going to see a box come up on your screen, which is going to be for an instant poll. And Rob, you can, there we go. So when you see that, please, we'd love to get your input and encourage you to participate when you see those polling questions, okay? So in terms of the questions we should be asking ourselves, one of the things that we need to think about is what we've been doing the past 20 to 40 years adequate to sustain our house for the next 20 to 50 years? Are we operating our house with the old mindset that, hey, the house was this way when I lived here, shouldn't that be good enough for us today? And are we prepared to meet the needs of the next generation of FIGAMs? We've also got to ask ourselves questions about, are we keeping up with the competition? on our campuses? And are we prepared for the fact that we may be hitting the lifespan limits for many of our houses, meaning that we no longer can put Band-Aids on some of the things that are happening structurally in our house, and it may be time for major renovations or even in some cases tearing houses down and rebuilding them. So those are some of the questions that we want to start challenging our house corporations to be asking and looking hard at. So what exactly is this 21st century approach that we're asking you to consider? Well, there's 4 elements that we're going to cover tonight. The first is talking about our fiduciary responsibility. The second is talking about how we can engage our shareholders better. And then the third, raising the bar on how we manage and maintain our properties. And the fourth area that we're going to cover tonight is talking about planning for the future.
Steve, if
so let's jump
quickly.
Yeah.
Brothers, if you were wondering how how you felt in response to that question of how confident are you that you can handle the future, 22% on this webinar said they were very confident, 61% somewhat confident, 17% said we're not prepared. So obviously, I think that lets us know that we might be in a little bit better spot than we might have first imagined, but certainly this help that we're providing house corporations is very much needed.
Super. Thanks, Rob. So yeah, let's talk about fulfilling our fiduciary responsibilities. Our first 21st century principle in this area is to recognize that by serving and running our local house corporations, we're simply a steward of an asset, and that we owe our shareholders, and in this case our shareholders are all the graduates of that chapter, regular communications regarding those assets. And brothers, I've served on 2 house corporations for over 20 years, and I know it's easy to get isolated. It's easy to sort of have the mindset that says, hey, our group's doing the work, so we'll make the decisions and we'll take care of everything, and these other guys that are never around, well, oh well. But this principle really says that we need to really change that mindset and open communication channels. And there's going to be a lot of reasons we'll be explaining throughout the rest of this webinar on why that communications is essential to our success as a house corporation. So the second principle that we want to talk about from a fiduciary standpoint, if we can go back to that last slide, is we need to conduct a public annual meeting with as many graduates of the chapter as possible. And most of the time we'll talk about this, we'll try to do that in conjunction with an existing event, most commonly a pig dinner. But that's an important thing that we make sure that we're doing. The third thing that we want to focus on is that we're meeting at least annually with our chapters and more frequently with the officers of those chapters to explain house corporation operations. We've got to remember that these are the future owners of the asset. And then our fourth principle is that we need to make sure that we're meeting our legal and financial obligations, things like payroll, reporting, HR, IRS reporting, 990s, and whatnot. So let's talk about engaging our shareholders. As I mentioned, our shareholders are the graduate members of our chapters. They're the people we represent when we serve as officers of the house corporation. And of course, the side benefit is this enables us and allows us to stay connected with those brothers and to make new connections from brothers from years past or decades past from our chapter. Engaging our shareholders is a part of our fiduciary responsibility. It's also essential to our overall success and critical to fundraising success. For those brothers that have engaged in a fundraising process with a professional fundraising company, the first thing they'll ask, and you'll remember that they asked, is, have you been doing a great job communicating with your graduate base, with your brothers, because the last thing you want to do is be out of touch, and the first communication is, hey, how about some money? So they're telling us that at minimum you need 2 solid years of good communication prior to starting a major campaign to be successful. So there's the fundraising aspect, but it's also part of our obligation as leaders in a house corporation to communicate well. It's also great for not-for-college days alone. By communicating with our fellow graduates of our chapters, we're going to be maintaining enthusiasm for the fraternity, and it's also going to help recruit new board members for the house corporation, board of chapter advisors, maybe even Purple Legionnaires down the road. So communication and engagement is really got multifaceted importance. So how exactly do we want or expect you to do this engagement? We're going to give you a quick sneak peek at a model communications plan that we put together. And so the overview for this is that when possible, we're going to certainly want to try to work closely with the chapter or utilize their existing communication efforts. But we need to understand that we should not be dependent on the chapter, because let's face it, some of the chapters where you aren't doing a great job communicating with the graduates. So if we were simply rely on them, we're not going to be effective in our communication goals. So when we can join with them, we want to, but we also know we need to be independent and understand we need to take responsibility for our communications as a house corporation. And the other thing to recognize is that what we're going to be doing is slightly different than what the undergraduate chapters are doing. So what is our goal? Our goal is to have 5 to 7 touches with graduate brothers per year. Most of those touches should be print or electronic or email communications. And then we can supplement those 5 to 7 touches with social media if you're so inclined. If you want to have a Facebook group, if you want to use Twitter or any of the other social media platforms. So we also need to have that one event annually, House Corporation annual meeting, and that's going to be ideally tied to the chapter's pig dinner. And usually that's a short meeting before the start of the pig dinner, but you can obviously do it before or after, however you wish. And then we are going to encourage you to try to have other graduate events that can be tied in with the chapter when possible. That can be things like homecoming, Founders Day. It could be a holiday season gathering. It could be joining the chapter for a meal, going to a sporting event on campus or in the community, whatever makes sense for your chapter and for your location. But we want to let you know that this engagement is really as important in many ways to your success as is your maintenance planning and some of the more operational things that you have been doing. Let's kind of dive into this real quick and talk a little bit about how this could look for you. We're going to talk about using a mix of channels of communication. Sadly, there's no one magic bullet that everybody can use that will allow you to reach everyone and be effective. And so we recommend that you consider using a multitude of methods, both traditional mail and printed communications, phone, email, website, social media. And so you can see we've asked for another quick poll and would encourage you to fill that out for us. And that question, if you're not in front of a screen, is what communication channel does your house corporation currently use most effectively now to engage graduates. One of the things that people ask, I think, is why do we have to use multiple methods? Can't we just send an email? Can't we just send a postcard? Isn't that good enough? And the truth is, the reason that you can't do that is because we have such a diverse range of ages within the fraternity. You're going to be dealing with new graduates who are 20, 21, and you're going to be dealing with brothers that graduated from your chapter decades ago. And you can imagine if you're using Facebook, if you decide that's the best method and something you're comfortable with, you're going to miss out, first of all, probably on a lot of the 20-year-olds because they don't use Facebook anymore. And certainly most of the 70 and 80-year-olds aren't going to be on Facebook either. So what we know from experience is that we have to communicate using different methods to be effective. And there's pros and cons to each of these methods. So, for instance, if we look at printed communications, the cons are certainly that it's slower, a slower process to get something developed and printed and mailed. It's a little bit more expensive, but the pros really outweigh the cons because historically we know this has one of the highest response rates. It has a higher deliverability rate. It's a proactive method of communication, and it's guaranteed to reach the entire population of the audience. And by the way, as you see on the note, we're currently working with the fraternity marketing team to develop some templates for you to use. Our goal with everything that we're going to be talking about tonight and that you'll see on our website is to develop resources to make this easier for you. We know that there's been a lot of things that you've needed to do and invent, and what we don't obviously need to do is reinvent this process 50 times for all the different house corporations listening tonight. So let's talk about phone communications for a second. Phone communication, another method that we're going to encourage you to use. Yes, it's a little bit slower to execute. It's obviously labor and time intensive. There's some expense associated with it. But what are the pros? The pros are it's very personal. You're going to actually have a two-way communication with brothers. So it's not a one-way communication. It's proactive, again, and it's going to reach potentially your entire population of your audience, meaning that if you have a list of 100 brothers you're going to call and you call all 100, you're going to reach everybody. If you post something on Facebook, you don't have any way to predict what percentage of people might see that post in their feed. The next area that we want to talk about is electronic communications, meaning email and websites. Now here we have some issues that are definitely worth noting. We're going to have a lower connection rate. We're going to have lower open rates. Historically, open rates for emails only range in the 20 to 40% range. It's harder to acquire and maintain those lists. In fact, the deliverability statistics suggest that about 40 to 50% of mass emails actually get delivered. And of course, people change their email addresses all the time. Poor donation rate. Our fundraising partners tell us that when it comes to communication, doing it by email has a much lower success and effectiveness rate than other methods of communication that we've already talked about. Websites aren't bad, but they're not effective unless you update the information frequently. You've got to give people a reason to come back to your website to see something different. And of course, these methods are reactive. Of course, on the pro side, it's fast, it's flexible, and it's a lower cost. So there are some pros, but there are definitely some cons. Social media, we've touched on this briefly, but these are rapidly changing communications. There's different technologies that are coming out all the time, and the popularity for generations is going to be hit or miss using different platforms. Obviously, we also know that if you're not on these platforms regularly, your messages are going to quickly get buried below dozens or hundreds of other messages and get lost in the clutter, if you will. It is instant. The pros, of course, of it being instant. It is flexible. There's a low cost or no cost associated with making these posts. So from that standpoint, it's really good, but it's not as we said, none of these are perfect and effective for all the generations. Well, we've talked about a couple of the different ways to communicate. Let's talk for a second about what we think is important for you to communicate. And this is where you're going to see a difference between chapter communications and what we're proposing should be important to you as a house corporation. We want you to be thinking about communicating graduate brother news, spotlights on graduates from other generations, updates on career moves, updates about news around from the college itself, what's happening on campus, and then, of course, chapter news and updates from the house corporation itself on upcoming renovations, and then encourage brothers to join you at some of those other upcoming graduate events that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, whether it's going to a sporting event, whether it's having a meal at the chapter house, or the other ideas that we shared. And then we also think it's important to recap past events and let people know what fun you had and who attended and those kinds of things. So I think that's the kinds of things that we want you to communicate. And the reason that this is important to pay attention to is the further we get from our graduation, our interests change. The newsletters from the chapter talking about intramural standings, that's pretty exciting the first couple of years we're out of college. But when we're 10, 20, and 30 years out of college, how well the intramural flag football team did maybe holds a little less interest to us. And so we have to recognize that, the chapter communications are different than what we as graduate brothers need to do to engage our fellow graduate brothers and keep them engaged and interested in supporting the chapter. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Okay, so we've talked about engaging our shareholders. Let's talk about our third principle, which is raising the bar on how properties are managed. And again, we're going to be sharing with you in the weeks and months ahead more about resources and tools that we have available for you. And I might also mention that we'll have some information that's available to you, I believe, Rob, through the screen. They'll be able to access that. So,
I'm sorry, Steve. I'm not sure what you're referencing through the screen. We do have. You will.
Go ahead.
I said, brothers. I think what you might be referencing is on your information panels there, brothers. You should see some handouts available, and those will certainly be those are certainly available on the 1848 site, and will certainly be available in the follow-up materials as well.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was talking about. Do you want to share, by the way, the results of the last instant poll?
Sure thing. So, brothers, when asked about your preferred method of communication or most successful communication, you indicated roughly half, 50%, said print or those traditional mailed communications, which is probably in line with what we see today. 41% email and website. 9% none, so 9% of brothers on this webinar not utilizing any form of communications, And interestingly, zero said phone or social media. So that's probably the most interesting part to me, Steve.
Good. All right. Appreciate it. And brothers, thank you for continuing to participate in those instant polls. So let's talk about raising the bar and how properties are managed. I think this is a topic that was really interesting and well received at the Ekklesia this summer. In this next slide, what you're going to see is what I think represents for a lot of our house corporations a pretty traditional 20-year cycle of what the house is like. If you look sort of starting in the left side, years 1 to 5, we've just done our last renovation and the house is great, and the brothers at the chapter are excited to be moving into the fresh new, whatever it was that you did, house. In the next 5 years after that, the brothers start to realize, it looked better when it was new. It's still nice, but it was better. The shine is sort of rubbed off. When we go to the right side of the curve, years 10 to 15, things are starting to look shabby again, and it's not very impressive. And the bad news is, we just did the renovation 10 years ago, so there's no real plans to be doing another renovation at this point. And so the undergraduates living there aren't too excited about things. And in that last part of the curve, years 15 to 20, things aren't good. We know we need to start to think about fundraising because the house has declined and we're in bad shape. The bad thing about this cycle, if you think about this, is you're probably going to have at least 50% of the brothers living in the house saying, the house wasn't that great when I lived there. And that's what we want to change. Because when you think about that, if that's, and if you agree with this model, and I can tell you that the brothers at the Ekklesia did, what that doesn't do is support recruitment success, because you've got at least 10 of the 20 years in that cycle where the brothers are really kind of not feeling proud of their house or happy to live in their house. So maybe one of the things, too, that we should be also considering as we factor in how we want to raise the bar on our properties is this. If you think about how your wife would feel if your son, if you have one, was going to move into the Fiji house right now, would your wife be happy about that or not? And I hate to use that as the illustration, but I've had actually a number of brothers tell me that they've had sons looking at the Fiji house, and the wives have said, no way, it isn't clean, it doesn't look safe, and we need to make sure that we're not in that cycle going forward. So what exactly do we recommend and how we can raise the bar? The first thing that we want to talk to you about is having a reserve study. A reserve study, and we know, by the way, that very few, if any, of our chapters have these from a survey that we did a number of months ago. A reserve study basically lists all the assets within the house: your roof, your furniture, your parking lot, your kitchen equipment, your boiler and furnace, your furniture, all those things. And it lists them out, and it basically takes and has you calculate what you think the estimated life of that item is, what the estimated replacement cost, including inflation, is, and then basically dividing that out so that you can calculate an annual amount of the life of that element of your house on an annual basis. And so by doing so, if you just bear with me for a quick example, if you say that your boiler is $40,000 and you just changed it, you just put in a new one, and it's got a 20-year life, then basically you're going to have $2,000 a year plus inflation that you're going to allocate out, so that, well, you're going to have to calculate what the replacement cost is. If you paid $40,000 today, you're not going to pay $40,000 20 years from now. So you're going to estimate the replacement cost and then calculate on an annual basis what percentage of that goes back on a year-by-year basis. And what's important about this is it allows the brothers that are using up the life of these assets to help pay for them in the future. And it's going to also help you from a financial standpoint, because we know a lot of our house corporations aren't factoring some of this in as they calculate what the market or what the rents need to be for their chapters. And so as a result, they're taking the basic elements of perhaps utilities, mortgage, insurance, and dividing that out and not factoring in these things. And that puts a greater burden on the house corporation over time to have funds available. The second thing that we want to talk about in raising the bar is making sure that we're meeting our human resource, financial, legal, and liability areas. This doesn't necessarily imply that we're asking you or suggesting that you have to outsource these things, but we need to make sure that all our house corporations are complying with the law. We need to understand what the HR practices are if you're employing chefs, if you're employing stewards, if you're employing house managers, in terms of how you compensate them, how you pay overtime, all those kinds of things we need to make sure we're in compliance with. We need to make sure that we're filing if you're doing your own payroll, we need to make sure that we're filing our quarterly payroll statements and doing all those things correctly. We need to have proper record keeping, of course, and so those are all important things. In addition, we need to ensure that we're minimizing our liability by employing best practices. And we've started to develop a list of best practices. I think that's one of the handouts that's available to you through the webinar. It's also available on the figam.org site under graduate resources in the 1848 properties page. But the truth is, even the best chapters are sometimes missing out on minimizing liability. I'll give you an example. I had the opportunity to visit one of our award-winning chapters at that was recognized many times at the Ekklesia this summer. And yet, when I toured that facility, we saw very basic things that were being overlooked. Items being stored in stairwells, bikes, mattresses, golf clubs, smoke detectors that had been disabled or didn't have batteries, propane tanks for their gas grills stored indoors in the kitchen. So even the best chapters need help and higher levels of attention in minimizing the liabilities. And so we need to really do great work in this area. We need to be doing our fire alarm tests. We need to be doing fire drills. We need to make sure that things are stored properly and that improvements are done properly and by trained professionals. We need to also raise the bar. We'll just go back to that one slide for one more second and make sure that we have adequate capital reserves. Again, going back to a survey that we did with many of the house corporations, we had about a third of the house corporations responding. There was a surprising number of house corporations that didn't have 6 months of operating capital in the bank. And so this goes back to proper budgeting, and so we're and making sure that we're charging market level rents. Again, one of the things that we noticed in that early survey that we did, that there were many chapters that reported that they weren't at market level. And so we're hurting ourselves by not bringing in enough revenue to enable us to do the maintenance and the repairs that we need to do around the house to keep it at a higher level. So the next thing we want to talk about is enhancing maintenance, why we want to enhance our maintenance plans and efforts. And largely that's really just pretty common sense, to improve the experience of our brothers living in the house. Living in the house should be a great experience, regardless of where luck may have it that you fall into that 20-year cycle in the chart that we showed a few minutes ago. And the other reasons that we want to enhance our maintenance is because it's going to extend the life of our investment, and it's going to reduce the cost of those periodic upgrades or renovations. So in short, this chart kind of shows really what we're trying to shoot for. We're going to look at the peak of this as the house being newly renovated, and what our goal is instead of having a curve, what we'd like to see our house corporations achieve is a flat line. Maybe that line isn't quite as high as the ultimate peak in the chart, but it's consistently at a much higher level than if we were doing peaks and the peak and valley approach of the traditional 20-year cycle. And so that's the goal and the challenge that we want to throw out to our house corporations across Phi Gamma Delta. So how many of our chapters have, house corporations have plans for cleaning, for repairs, for basic maintenance, or for bathrooms, for carpets, for hardwood floors, for painting? I think what we know is a lot of house corporations are more reactive than proactive when it comes to these things, and respond to making necessary repairs when needed. But instead, we know, for instance, hardwood floors, that if we can be proactive and have a plan, we can avoid having to sand and recoat hardwood floors. Instead, we can skim and just simply put additional polyurethane on top of it, and at about a quarter of the cost. So if we have a structure and a plan for different things, we can extend the lives of our carpet. There's all sorts of studies out there talking about keeping carpets clean will extend their lives tremendously. So if we can do these things and be proactive and strategic about them, we're going to have a much higher, much better experience for the people living in the house, and we're actually going to save money in the long run. And the last thing that we want to talk about in terms of maintenance is that broken windows concept. And that broken windows concept is one that's actually used in a lot of community development types of environments. And it's basically one that says we want to respond quickly when anything gets broken within the house, because what we know is when we start to see damage, when we start to see wear and tear and neglect, it changes the attitude of the people living in that house or in that community, and they think it's okay not to take care of the house because it's already got, dirty carpets, or it's already got holes in the wall, so it's no big deal if there's another hole in the wall. And so this broken windows concept is one where we want to see the chapter and house corporation working together so that as soon as there's a problem, it's quickly addressed and repaired, and so that the impression of the house is always that it's in great condition and desirable. So in terms of some other points for this session, we're obviously only together for a little bit over an hour tonight. We are going to encourage you to jump onto the FIGAM.org site and go to the 1848 properties page, and you'll be able to see some of the other best practices that we've identified. And again, our goal is in the coming months to have tools and resources for each one of those best practices for you to utilize as a guide as you work on implementing them. Our fourth principle tonight is planning for the future. And we talked about the concept of continually planning. And that's something that we want to encourage all our house corporations to be doing. We should always be working on the next one or two renovation plans. We can't be flat-footed. Houses, as we talked about earlier, in terms of a life cycle, generally, if you talk to architects, there's sort of a 50-year and 100-year lifespan in terms of the construction methods and materials used. And so one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, and it's our next quick poll question, is where do you see your house in its life cycle? And that's critical as a house corporation board member to understand, because if you're in the nearing the end of that cycle, that means that there's obviously some big needs coming up in the future. So take a look. Please respond to that question for us, and we'll have Rob pop in here in a minute and let us know what the summary of our audience tonight is. But the concept here, again, is that we want to be looking sort of in a 5, 10, and 25-year horizon. And that's sort of an ongoing and continuous process that will be revised. It's not something that this isn't something that it needs to be fancy and go up on a bookshelf, but it should be something that the House Corporation is referencing on a the House Corporation Board is referencing on a regular basis and changing and reprioritizing as needed. We also think that it's important and valuable to engage the chapter in this planning process, as well as your fellow graduate brothers. And then lastly, we need to recognize that there's yep.
If I may, I think we've probably collected our answers, and it's interesting to see where everyone sits tonight as we talk about planning for the future. Looking at our own life cycles of our chapter houses, about 11% of our brothers here say they've got a lot of life left. They've just done a major renovation project or built a new house. The majority here tonight, 40%, 42% now, would say that they're mid-cycle, so they recognize they need to start planning, but they're not in a critical phase. 26% would say that the house is near the end of its useful life cycle, but fortunately they've been planning and that they're ready to go. Unfortunately, 5% say that they recognize it's near the end, but they've got no plan, and 16% say that they are past the point of planning. The house is past its useful life, and I guess the idea there is that we need to act.
Yeah, 16% say it's past its useful life, Rob.
16% of the brothers on the webinar tonight, yes.
Wow. Okay. Well, great. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely insightful, and frankly, it's not new information to the 1848 Properties Board. I mean, given Phi Gamma Delta's long history, and we understand that a lot of the houses in our system, have been built 50 to 100 years ago, and that's poses a huge challenge for us. And going back to just the last slide before Rob switched, and you don't have to switch it back necessarily, but that's fine, is recognizing the lead time needed for major projects. We had a presentation at the Ekklesia on fundraising, and we went into some great detail, and that'll probably be an upcoming webinar topic in the next couple of months. But the fact is, a major renovation project and fundraising for that, is a multi-year process. And it's not something that you can just sort of, wing, 3-6 months out and say, gosh, let's get this going. So when we're planning for the future, brothers, we want to be thinking about a couple of key areas. Focusing on safety has got to be a high priority for us. I'd love for us to all agree that our main mantra should be not while I'm on the House Corporation Board. And to that I mean that we just don't want any safety or security issue to happen in a chapter house while we're serving. And so we need to be diligent, we need to be planning, especially for the safety aspects in our chapter houses, and make sure that they're absolutely as safe as they can be. As we do our planning, we obviously want to focus on the highest impact areas for the people living there. So common areas, living areas, the kitchen and dining, so that the food experience is good, and chapter room. And we want to be also thinking to the future about other things that impact the experience of living in the house, whether that's things like internet, electrical, heating and cooling, parking, or recreation. Those obviously are going to help increase and improve the experience for the people living in the chapter house. So we've covered, we've touched on a lot of areas. We recognize that in this kind of setting and in the time frame we've allotted, that we can only kind of skim the surface on a lot of these topics with you. But I want to leave you with the thought of imagining if FIGAMS were known to have the best brothers, the best housing and living condition, and the best food of all the fraternities on campus, how would that change the success of your chapters and the trajectory of your chapters if we were known for that? So at this point, brothers, I'm going to turn this back over to Rob. We're going to have a Q&A time with you, and I hope you'll ask questions and share thoughts on this session with us. So Rob, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, brothers, for giving up some time tonight.
Steve, thank you. Thank you for taking the lead on getting this information out to our brothers tonight. So brothers, again, I've put this out via chat, but if you have questions, and we've received a few already, but if you have questions, now's the time to ask them. Use that questions feature on your screen to shoot those our way, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. I think we were scheduled to be done at 8 o'clock. We'll probably extend a few more minutes as long as everyone can take it with us. So Steve, I've just got a kind of a warm-up question that I want to ask you. You've been working with 1848 for a year or so now, and you've been digging in quite extensively to the operations of our house corporations and conditions of our chapter houses. Humor me and just share with us, what do you think is the most surprising thing you've seen or learned over the past year?
Yeah, I think it's a dual edge. There's two things. One, Rob, I'm so impressed. I was at Academy and the Ekklesia. I mean, I'm so impressed with the dedication and the passion that our brothers, our graduate brothers, have to work on and be a part of housing for their chapters. I mean, the passion. I had conversations with some brothers, at midnight and past midnight, talking about specific issues that they're facing in their house corporation. And so we are so lucky to have men that had a great experience as an undergraduate, willing to continue on and serve our current undergraduates and help them have a great experience. I think the other side of that coin, and I alluded to it, is I think that, and it's I guess not really so much a surprise, but is I think there's we've done a disservice a little bit, I have to say, to our fellow brothers by not having 1848 properties in existence 20 years ago. I mean, I get the frustration of having to reinvent, figuring out answers that have been figured out by chapters, for decades before. But until you have to do your first major renovation, it's something that you've never done or experienced. And so I'm really excited about hopefully being able to be a clearinghouse of information, a better clearinghouse of information, and to be providing resources so that we can ease the burden of our graduate brothers out there running house corporations, doing the absolute best that they can, and they have been doing the best that they can, and hopefully making this process easier for them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Steve. Appreciate that insight. So, brothers, now for some of the questions that you've asked. Mike Wagaki, a Rose Holman brother and section chief in the Chicago and southern Wisconsin area, was referencing back to very, very early on in the presentation tonight, and I think some of the struggles that some of our house corporations face, and some of the struggles from local and state government. And so he was asking what Pennsylvania laws were you specifically mentioning. I think Pete Welsh, I think you wanted to try and address that, didn't you?
Yeah, hi, this is Pete. If this is specific to Pennsylvania law, I'm in California, and I'm afraid I'm not qualified to do that, but I might redirect to groups. Certainly, there are brothers in Pennsylvania that can, that are probably involved in legal work that can have very accurate, direct answers. I think that's more a state-specific question.
Yeah, Pete, let me jump in, Steve here. I think what I was alluding to was some of the actions in the legislature following the Penn State incident, in respect to their efforts to invoke, I believe it would be eminent domain, but basically when they were proposing in future cases where hazing occurred, where the state would have the right to take over or take assets from a fraternity, physical assets, house, and that's what I was referencing in the presentation in terms of the involvement of governments. Yeah.
And Steve, this is Josh. I'll take this one kind of from the Arcanet side, and what we're seeing kind of as a trend that is emerging kind of from a macro standpoint. Penn State is one of those where when legislatures and even town governments, like city governments, see that or believe that the universities are not doing a good enough job, and the fraternities system's not doing a good enough job to police the fraternity system, they're stepping in and introducing zoning regulations in some cases. In the case of Penn State, there was there was an anti-hazing bill after the death of Mike Piazza that was a draft bill that they were pushing forward that would basically allow either the university or local authorities to confiscate the chapter house if there is a hazing violation. What we're seeing also in one other city, there's zoning. There's a zoning issue, and this is Ann Arbor, Michigan. And basically what they've done is the Ann Arbor City Council has said that in order to be operated as a fraternity house or sorority house, for the zoning purposes, you have to be recognized by the university or get a special allowance from the city zoning commission to operate as a fraternity or a sorority house. So we're seeing several of this, and it's one of the reasons for the brothers who are at the Ekklesia might have heard Judd Horace, who's the president of the National Interfraternity Council. We're doing a lot more. He's doing a really good job of focusing, of representing the fraternities more as our trade association and how you would traditionally think about a trade association. And he is organizing and really doing a good job pushing back on some of these state laws and then also on some city ordinances, et cetera, when it impacts the entire fraternity community. So I think that's something you'll see from the Arcanet standpoint. We'll continue to track this, and we'll continue to be engaged pretty closely to make sure that we are protecting the equities of our chapters and the equities of our housing corporations as well. Rob, is there anything you want to add to that kind of as we push forward? But I do think that as we push more into, as we continue down more of the litigious relationship with kind of some of the local governing authorities, you'll continue to see more of this. And I think you'll continue to hear more about it from the Arcanet, but also the international headquarters, as well as the broader Greek community.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't really add much, just echo what Josh and Steve had really mentioned there. I mean, I don't think we're going to be seeing less of this in the future. I think the complication there, particularly with local ordinances, it takes a lot to really know what's going on at the local level and for folks to really dig in. So I think that's the benefit that we've been seeing from initially from the national or the North American Interfraternity Conference, but also that's a benefit, I think, of having 1848 and having a greater focus on the housing component of the fraternity operation just helps us to deal with those sort of things a little bit better. But Josh, that actually segues pretty well. Josh?
No, if I can do one other, if I can just kind of tie that up, Rob, I think that's one of the things that I focused on the NIC and the international headquarters, but I think a key component to that, and you hit the nail on the head, Rob, is the local ordinances, et cetera. And I think that's where you'll continue to see kind of, and I think this is where 1848 Properties has a unique role, is driving kind of that decision loop to make sure that NIC headquarters, local authorities are all looped in and communicating effectively as we move forward. So we have a clear understanding of what's going on at the local level.
Yeah, and this is Pete. I'll just concur with all of that. The thing to watch most closely, I think, is the local level, and the tool that the local level will have is through zoning. Zoning can change, and the use allowed within a zoning area can change and eliminate an occupancy by X number of people in a house, and that effectively disallows a fraternity. That's where I believe you have the potential greatest initial impact.
And this gets complicated, brothers, because as we talked about, and as you know in your experiences, universities now are getting more engaged with us on a housing basis when we're trying to do expansions and build houses. They're often trying to exert control by providing land and a land lease. And then we're subject, obviously, to the terms of not only the terms of that lease, but staying in good standing with the university. And so not only has Phi Gamma Delta experienced this, but many other Greek organizations where all of a sudden we build a house and the level of support is high, and all of a sudden there's hazing incidences across the country, and now all of a sudden the universities are taking a much tougher stance, and then we're faced with a situation as we currently are with one of our chapters where we were suspended, and then of course we violate the land lease, and so now we have a situation where we have just have invested millions of dollars in a house, and we're now at the mercy of the university to try to provide some compensation for us. So these are complicated times, is really what I was alluding to in that early part of the presentation, that we just have to be aware of.
And getting us to think more on the maybe to the how we really deal with that. Josh, I'd like to see if you can take a stab at this question. Mike Bevis with Miami University as how would we recommend, or how should house corporations work with universities in these complicated times, in these troubled times? What would your advice be on that, Josh?
Yeah, sorry about that, Rob. I was on mute there. No, I think it's in one of these cases, in a case we've actually dealt with here within the last 6 months or so, in one of our chapters in Florida, there was a decision to close the chapter, suspend the chapter. The house corporation, the university decided they were going to take the house. So and take the house because the group was no longer recognized, or the chapter is no longer recognized. And basically, the role of the undergraduates, or the graduate chapters, and local graduates, I should say, in the house corporation, they oftentimes have some of those best relationships with the university community. They've got the best relation. They know the zoning a lot better. They know the local real estate laws a lot better. We can provide we can help provide best practices and guide kind of what that conversation should be. But I think from the local graduate standpoint, and this one case for the chapter in Florida, it was the local graduates who ended up negotiating kind of a fair outcome to ensure that they got fairly compensated for the value of the chapter house, because it was a ground lease. They own the chapter house, or they own the physical structure, but it was a ground lease and the university owned the ground. So I think that was one of those that maintaining that relationship with the local university, even though it was adversarial, the relationships between the local graduates and some of the university community helped it get to a better place than what it would have been otherwise. So I think maintaining those relationships at the local level is critically important, because you never know when you might need them. And that's the best way to turn a potentially bad situation into a less bad situation, if it's kind of moving in that direction. Does that answer the question from kind of that standpoint?
I think so.
Yeah, I think we got it, Josh. I think I might just add, sometimes it can be tempting to kind of be on guard a little bit more and really even put ourselves in more of an adversarial position. But I think we've got to look at the long game, and the more we're willing to work with our campus partners and try and find equitable solutions, the better place our chapters are in, the better place our house corporations are in. And I think understanding to save the fight for where it's really needed, because you can only pull that card so many times. Steve, I'd like to kind of change gears on us. John Sneed, who I believe is a Georgia Tech brother, but works with the Johns Hopkins chapter, says, we didn't address house corporations without houses to any depth tonight. He's wondering, is there any material for organizations facing that problem? And I guess, kind of what's the future plan for 1848 and supporting those groups or house corporations in the making, or those kind of special scenarios which exist?
Yep. Well, first thing, my first quick reaction to that is that we need to recognize that that's not necessarily a problem. The fact is, within Phi Gamma Delta, 25% of our chapters don't have a house and are thriving and are successful. And we're seeing new models in different universities where housing is not even an option. So I would maybe reframe that to eliminate the word problem. But to that end, we do recognize that there are chapters and house corporations out there that can have a house and want to have a house. And in fact, that was one of the topics that we addressed at the Ekklesia, and we had a session called How to Get Started When You Don't Have a House. And we will definitely get that scheduled, John, as a webinar in the coming months. If that's something specific to any of you still on the webinar, you can email us through the FIGAM website, and we'd be happy to send you this slide deck. And one of our board members would be more than happy to be in touch with you and follow up with you and talk through the content that we developed for that presentation. And we understand that this particular session really was focused for those chapters that do have operating houses. So, John, I hope this was still helpful to you, but we understand that this was really focused on a little different message tonight.
Great, thanks, Steve. John says thank you. You're very welcome, John. I'm going to take one more question that I'm happy to answer. Well, two questions, both from Bill Oliver. Bill, I hope you're doing well. By the way, Bill Oliver with Penn State has been the topic of conversation tonight. First, Bill had asked, and I'll just reiterate to everyone, we have been recording this webinar tonight, and we are going to make that available. I will also make sure that we have the slide deck available, and we'll get that out to folks who are participating tonight as well. But Bill asked, he says, we all need donations. And this is back to some of the, I think, really communications, which Steve was talking about earlier. But we all need donations, and brothers feel more secure donating to the fraternity in lieu of a P.O. box or some other address. And he says, why did we, the headquarters, stop the service? So what Bill's referencing is the fraternity has a graduate communication services program, which can help house corporations and undergraduate chapters to produce those important communications to our graduates. So newsletters, invitations, solicitation letters down the line. For some period of time, we had offered essentially a fundraising collection into that service. And the short answer on that, Bill, is it was a lot of work on our end that we were just really not best equipped to do. We just had to recognize that and put staff time where it could best support us helping to communicate with undergraduate chapters. So I understand your feeling there, and I understand, particularly with a group that had been using that for some time, I understand that was a tough situation to have to find an alternative there. But unfortunately, we just had to recognize that we're not that great at it. We're not best equipped to do that in the capacity we're talking about. And we know some good partners who are. So that was the gist of why we stopped that service. Well, Steve, I think we're at about 15 after the hour. I think we've worked through most of our questions, and I think appreciate those, brothers. I think, Steve, is there anything else you'd like to add, or any other 1848 board members before we conclude tonight?
No, I just again would thank everybody for giving up some time in the evening and sharing it with us. We're very excited about the future of housing for Phi Gamma Delta, and I hope we've got you thinking a little bit about housing maybe a little different than you did before you joined the call. Maybe you've recognized some areas that you're doing well, and maybe some areas where there's room for improvement. And we understand, as we started to say, everybody's going into this from a different place. And we just want you to know, brothers, we're here to help and support you the best we can. And we all, of course, have the same goal, which is to make Phi Gamma Delta the absolute best fraternity, and to make sure that all our undergraduates have a great experience. So we're excited and look forward to be working with you in the future. We're going to be announcing other webinars in the next few weeks. So we'll be getting a schedule of these set up. So please watch your email for that, and we really appreciate your support and your efforts. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve, again for your time tonight, and to the 1848 board for the work that you are doing to better Phi Gamma Delta and better our chapter houses. Well, brothers, that's all we have tonight. We again appreciate your being on here and the work that you do with your house corporations or in your other roles. This was the first of many in a planned series to help better support our chapters and our house corporations. We hope you benefited from it and enjoyed it. Again, if there's anything we can ever do to help you, please let us know. www.phigam.org/1848properties. Have a good evening, brothers.
Thanks, Steve. Great job.
Have a great night, brothers.